Welcome everybody! To create this effect today, we're going to be using things like the stroke effect, puppet pin, expressions, and also the echo effect. So let's get into it. You can go to Object, then Expand and click OK. So now you'll be able to select individually each part of your text. Select the item that you want to remove, press Ctrl X and then create a new layer and press Ctrl Shift V to paste in the same place, and do the same thing to any other elements that you might need to. If you want to do the same thing in After Effects, go to create shapes from text, and now you have it. You can select each singular element. Let's import our Illustrator file, go to Composition and Layer Size. Press OK. And now open up your composition and make sure that you're using settings just like this: 19 by 20 by 1080. And let's solo our text layer so we can work only on it. Let's search for stroke in our effects tab and let's apply our stroke effect to our text layer. Select the pen tool so we can draw over our text layer. Okay, so before you do anything with your pen tool, let me tell you something first. I know that a lot of times it might seem more natural to make our lines in sort of simulating the same way that we would write something in real life. So something more like this. Now this has some problems. Me, personally, I think that something like this would work better. And here's why. Here, this looks more like handwriting, it's the way that the lines are drawn in real life. Problem is, that creates a flow of an animation that's not very consistent. If we try to get one single line and try to draw in our whole word, you see that there's a lot of lines here who are just conflicting with each other. This not only makes animation which is less pleasant to the eye, but also our viewer won't be sure to where he should look at. Even in a simple animation like this has some effect, even if not that much. But when working in more complex animation, this is something to always make sure of. So for example, let's look at this chart right here. This is how we are going to do our example today. If we see here, if we try to draw one single line, we can actually draw one single line to show the flow of our animation. Not only this is going to show that our animation is much more pleasant to the eye, but very important as well, is going to make sure that our viewer know where he has to look at. There are no conflicting lines right here. This in animation is one of the principles that we call staging. And staging is really important, especially when it comes to motion graphics. It's the thing that tells our viewer where to look at in what moment. And when it comes to motion graphics, where you're more limited when it comes to resources, it is really important to make sure that your animation tells where people should be looking at. So here's how we're going to do it. Let's try to draw our line as much as possible close to the center of the letters, but it doesn't have to look perfect. So now, going over to our stroke options, let's choose all masks, stroke sequentially, and brush size, let's try to cover our letters completely, and brush hardness, let's change this to 100%. So now let's change from unoriginal image to reveal original image. And if we change the value of our end property, we're going to see that our letters are going to be animated. If you see that kind of problem, everything that you have to do is to move your path a little. I told you to make the path as much in the middle as possible, but when you have this kind of little artifacts appearing because of your mask, you'll have to change some of the masks to be, instead of in the very middle, to be closer to the sides. What you want to do is to try to fix that as much as possible. But let me tell you, it can be quite challenging sometimes, especially with letters that are cursive and they're pretty thick. So there's not much way to avoid this as far as I know. So try to do as best as you can in that step. But because we'll be adding so many effects later, they won't be as noticeable in the long run. Let's make a keyframe on our end property. Press U to see your keyframes. And now we're going to animate from 0% to 100%. Well, it is working already, but I feel like it's a bit too fast. So let's change our second frame from 30 frames to 6 frames, or 1 second to 2 seconds. Looks better now. Next, let's select our puppet ping tool and let's start to make some points. So here's the logic behind it. And that's it. Now let's press U to see all of our frames. Let's select all of them and let's click on the stopwatch so we can delete them. And now it comes the magic part. So let's select one of our puppets. You see here where we can see that the line is just over our puppet ping? So let's go back 2 frames. Let's select it, let's find it in our layers, and let's click on the stopwatch to make a keyframe. Let's go over 2 frames and now let's create another frame. Now press Alt on the stopwatch and press our expression. Before using it, let's change some of the values. So for amplitude, we can keep the same as 0.05, but for frequency, we're going to change this to 2. And for decay, we're going to change this to 6. Very good. So now let's go back to our very first frame that we created, and we're going to move our puppet thing to the opposite direction that the line is going to. So now if we play this, you can see that it bounces. So now it's time to do the same thing, but for the other points as well. So let's check what it looks like. Much better. So just that single expression and some puppet paint made our text, which was very stiff and very dry, look much more playful and much more alive. Let's pre-compose this. I'm going to call this text animation and select move all attributes. I'm going to press Ctrl Alt T so I can time remap our layer. And now I'm going to do this because our original animation is with a linear kind of animation, but I want some of the letters to be faster and some others to be a bit slower. So I'm going to create some points depending on the point in animation that I want to be faster or slower. And keep in mind, most of the time when you have some kind of line which is very long, some kind of stroke that's very long, most times you want this to be faster to combine some kind of acceleration and velocity. But most of the time when you have a text which is a bit shorter, you don't really need to do that. In the same way, you want the beginning and especially the middle to be faster, but the ending to be a bit slower to give a bit of a character to it. So that looks nice already, but just to wrap things up, we're going to press F9 on our very first layer, make our easing a lot stronger. The difference itself is very subtle, but it's too important. It's something that you can not really see, but for sure something that you can feel. But before that, I still want to select all my layers, hold Alt and drag them, just to make the start a little bit faster. And now it's finally time to animate our dots. So let's start by the first one. Let's move our anchor point to the bottom. And let's make sure that our layer is starting at the same point that the highlighter is also starting to appear on our screen. Now let's turn on position. Let's move some frames forward. Now let's go back and let's animate this going in the same direction as our highlighter is going to To give a bit more character as well, let's press Alt on our stopwatch and let's paste the same expression as before. And remember the values, 2 for frequency and 6 for decay. And that's what our animation looks like. But still, I'm going to move this just 1 frame backwards. Now it's time to animate our scale property. Let's create a keyframe right at the start of our layer. Let's move 2 layers forward for now. Now the first one is going to be 0 and the second one 100%. Now let's make sure to press F9 and we're going to set to an ease of 100%. But obviously our keyframes are way too close together, so let's split them apart a bit. I think that 6 frames seems to be enough. And now we can repeat the exact same process for our second dot. So good job, we already have our text pretty much working now, but we're still going to add a lot more elements and detail to this to make sure that it looks a lot more interesting. So now let's create a shape layer. To help me out a bit, I'm going to activate my proportional grid, and then on my settings for my shape layer, I'm going to choose no stroke at all and a black fill. Let's create a circle right in the middle of our composition. Compare its size to the thickness of your letters, just make sure that they are pretty similar. We're going to start out by our L letter. And let's make sure that our anchor point is just right in the middle of our shape. Now it's time to animate it. Let's create a position keyframe. Let's go back 10 frames. And let's move this down and a bit backwards as well. Let's use our pen tool to draw our curves. So you can click on your points and then just drag them to make sure that they look just as you want to. Let's string our layer to the very first keyframe and move it back. So I'm going to change our ease properties and make this a very strong ease in. Let's go back to our timeline and make sure to trim the end part of it. Now let's select our layers and move it back just 2 frames. Now to make this look a lot better, let's add an echo effect to our shape. We're going to have 20 number of echoes for now. Use that to make a trail, as you can see, but for now our dots look way too spaced out. Let's change the value of our echo time. This value, the closer together our dots are going to be. The easiest way to do it is to select Ctrl and then to move our value to the lowest number as possible. But if you need to make it lower, you can write it down. Now as you can see, now our shape layer has a trail behind it. Let's make sure to animate its scale going from 0% to 100% in around 6 frames. And press F9 to ease out our animation. Also, let's make it a bit slower. So our dots are still a bit too far apart. So instead of going with a lower number, I'm going to make my number of dots a bit bigger and then lower the number later. This will make the effect a bit more intensive on your GPU, but it does look a lot better and a lot more smooth. Just as a last adjustment, since I want the stroke to be a little bit bigger, let's put some more points on it. So for now, what we're going to do, we're going to duplicate this point and going to do some more points around it. Everything that you have to do is duplicate your layer, move it a bit forward, and then change the position of your starting point and then your ending point as well. The process itself should be pretty straightforward. If you have any kind of problems, you can see that in a lower speed on YouTube, or you can rewatch that first dot that we did, because the process is pretty much the same for all of them except for one. On this part right here, instead of doing a trail coming from outside of the word into the word, I want this one to come from in the word to out of the word and then in back again. So as you can see here, everything that I'm doing is changing the curve that we had. So it's not different from the other points that we did. The only thing that changes here is that it starts right into the beginning of our word. So because of this, we're not going to have a zoom into our first keyframe, because the impact is coming directly from the U letter. As you can see right here, it doesn't really make sense to have a scale animation just like we had in the other ones, because since it's coming out of the U, the already need to start with some thickness to it instead of 0%. So in that case, you can simply delete the scale. So as you can see, by doing that, we're able to add some complexity to our text animation and make it a bit more alive, a bit more interesting as well. So as you can see here, I don't really want this to go like that, because this point is coming outside of our word that we are doing. So it's a bit distracting to the eye. And that's why I'm going to go back, and I want this to start from the L letter and then going back into our word. That way, our extra elements are going to help reinforce the idea that the eyes of our viewer should be looking straight at the letters, not at the elements outside of it. And something else that I also want to change, this dot right here is going a bit too fast for my liking. So I'm just going to make the layer a little bigger so it doesn't animate that too fast. Now I'm going to move all my layers 2 or 3 frames forward, and then I'm going to make my very first dot a little bigger as well. So it starts only with the dot, and then we can see all the word coming together. Something else that I also want to do is that here on our position graph, I want us to have a little bit less of is it in the start, and on the end, I don't want is in out at all. So that way it makes a bit more sense to how it would physically work if that was an actual real thing, or things that are moving together in real life. Now our text is almost done, but something really important I want to do is the underline. And this is going to be really important too, because it's also going to be connected to our text. And the way that you can do this is by also duplicating, and we're going to do something very similar to before. We're going to make our dot coming out from the top of the D letter, and then it's going to morph into our underline. That curve looks a bit too narrow, so it's not really that natural, so I want to make it a bit rounder because it makes it easier and a little more pleasing to the eyes. I'm also going to make the scale in the end a bit more thick, and yeah, that works already. But we can still polish a bit more that beginning, because it really doesn't feel like one thing is connected to the other. So let's move it a bit, move a bit of our curve. So just like with our text, we're going to do also a stroke animation right here. We're going to make from right to left, and we're going to set up our stroke just the same as before. So get your brush size, try to make as big as necessary, brush hardness at maximum, and select all masks. And now you can animate your end property from 0% to 100%. So let's change the ease out of our end animation. Let's try to make something a lot more stronger. Now let's make a new null object, and then we're going to place it right here at the start of our underline. So what we're going to do is to rotate this just a bit, and now we're going to parent our underline to our null. So as you can see now, we have kind of this stretch controller if we control the size of our null. We're going to use this to make a bounce animation by reusing once more our Boeing expression. So I made this from 100% to 90%, but just in the X value, the Y value is always 100%, and paste our expression, and that's what it looks like. I'm just going to make my animation a bit shorter and also bring it a bit more to the back. Also, as you can see here, I forgot to rename all my layers, so please do that so we don't forget what is what. So now as you can see, our morphing doesn't look too good yet because we're not changing the color of our stroke. So we're going to apply a gradient ramp. For the first color, I'm going to choose that greenish tone, and for that second color, that bluish tone that we have on our underline. Let's change the start point of our ramp to here, and let's change the end of the ramp here. So it will start blue and then end to be green. But because we want our trail to start black, we want to go to blend with original and go to 100% and then animate this value to 0% at the end of our animation. Let's pre-compose all of our animation, and we can name it something like text animation comp, and then press OK. Now we're going to draw over our frames. So you're going to select your brush tool, and let's change this to black, and let's give a double click on our composition. Now here on the settings of our brush, we're going to change this from constant to single frame. And we're going to choose our brush. So let's make sure the hardness is at max. And so what we're going to do here is that we're going to draw at the end of our stroke, so it looks a little bit more like paint. What we can do is that we can go from one frame to the other by pressing Ctrl arrow to the left or to the right. You can do that with a drawing tablet, and it's a bit easier to do with a drawing tablet, but because this is such a simple kind of drawing that you're doing, you can also do with a mouse as well. Remember that when you have this kind of animation where one line or the stroke is coming out of the word, then you should try to do the kind of connection of paint that breaks in. You're going to do that basically frame by frame, and I know that this is quite a time-consuming process, and from all the things that we did until now, I would say that it's one of those details you cannot see as much, but you can feel it. If you're short on time, I would say that you do not really have to do that, but I still think that if you're working on something personal or if you have some time left, I would recommend to do this. As you can see, it's a pretty subtle effect, but it just makes our text animation look a bit more polished. Now let's pre-compose this. Let's call it text animation liquid effect. And let's choose move all attributes into the new composition. And now this is really to wrap things up once and for all. We're going to duplicate our layer, and then we are going to effects and presets and add a fill effect. Now we're going to change the color of that fill to either green or blue. In that case, I'm going to choose green. And if you look really closely, you can see that you can sort of see the edges of our text that it's underneath it. So we're going to use a simple choker effect. So we're going to set this to 1, and this is going to make our text a bit more thinner so we cannot see it underneath the other one. We're going to offset the top frame by only 1 bit, and remember the color frame is the one underneath it and the black one is the one on top. And now this looks really cool, but we're going to change that red color to something else. Now let's create a new solid. Let's make it white or another color depending on what you want, and let's call it background. Let's move this to under other layers, and now there you have it. You just finished your liquid text animation.